Christine Moody was a 32-year-old woman starting over after a difficult marriage.
Christine had finally made the decision to open her heart back up to love.
And she would get her second chance in the arms of a 27-year-old preacher son named Jeremy Moody.
He was heavily involved in church.
He's just a good old boy from South Carolina, and she could be the girl next door.
But their faith in God wasn't the only thing that connected them.
The attraction and the intensity is there. Felt like a fairy tale.
Within just months, they were married.
But their picture-perfect romance would be ripped apart when police discovered a grisly double homicide.
They were stabbed multiple times.
It was disgusting.
Now, follow investigators as they try to determine what caused this baffling crime. See chilling video footage that reveals the victim's final moments and unearth evidence that leaves police wondering if this seemingly God-fearing couple was hiding something more evil and terrifying than anyone could imagine.
You couldn't turn the channel without hearing the story.
This was their moment of glory. This was their 15 minutes of fame.
They had wanted to go down in history.
July 21st, 2013, Union County, South Carolina. It was just after 8:30 p.m. when a local man stopped to pick up his car from a neighbor, an amateur auto mechanic who ran a repair shop out of his garage.
A neighbor had come to get his car fixed, and as he came up to the house, he noticed the front door was open.
The man called out to see if anyone was home, but heard no answer. Concerned, he tried to enter the house, but he was met by his neighbor's barking dogs.
And the animals that were in there would not let the neighbor in.
The dogs were clearly upset, and their paws were smearing something on the glass door. It was blood. The neighbor immediately called 911. Within minutes, a patrol officer arrived. By that point, the dogs were no longer guarding the front door and had retreated somewhere inside the house.
As I walked up to the house, I noticed the side door was open. I announced that I was the sheriff's office. No one come to the door.
The officer cautiously entered the home. He carefully searched each room but could find no sign of the occupants. That is, until he reached the living room.
I looked in the den and seen a male and a female on the couch.
Both victims were covered in blood. The dogs were guarding the bodies and wouldn't let the officer any closer. But even from a few feet away, he could tell both victims had been shot, and the woman had been repeatedly stabbed.
And it looked like they was deceased.
She was slumped over the couch with her throat cut. It was disgusting.
But who could have committed such a heinous act of violence? Was this the result of a robbery gone horribly wrong? Or was there a much darker motive at play? Born in 1977, Christine Moody grew up in Southern California. But her life wasn't always sunny.
She wasn't raised in a very loving environment, and there were signs of physical abuse.
Christine had a sad childhood, and she carried that pain, really, her whole life.
As the result, Christine had a hard time trusting anyone, and as a child, she found it difficult to make friends.
Christine was lonely, and she pretty much kept to herself.
Christine decided to turn her life around after high school. Moving out on her own, she was determined to overcome her painful youth.
She starts trying to go out more and meet new people. Eventually, she meets a nice guy, and they start dating.
She met this guy, and seemingly, everything was great.
After dating only a few months, Christine's first boyfriend asked her to marry him. At the time, she was 25, and she thought all of her dreams had come true. But Christine's happiness wouldn't last. After a few years, Christine and her husband began having problems. She divorced her husband and moved to Colorado, where she started dating an old acquaintance from her youth. But her new relationship had a dark side.
He beat her on several occasions. And like some abusive relationships, Christine thought, you know what? He's gonna stop. But he never did.
She was unable to handle the abuse any longer, and so she was brave enough to leave him.
After Christine gets away from him, she vows, I'm never gonna be a victim again.
Now in her early 30s, Christine moved back to California, where she not only found a chance to start over, but a newfound sense of independence as well.
For the first time, there are no family members or an abusive man controlling her. And this has to really be a freeing and just a great feeling for her.
But Christine was still lonely. Then, at 32 years old, Christine decided to try a new approach to finding her soulmate: the internet.
When Christine had finally made the decision to try to open her heart back up to love, she chose the avenue of online dating.
And as Christine looked through the photos of all her possible online matches, one man caught her attention.
She comes across the profile for a strapping young man named Jeremy Moody. And to her, there was just something special about him.
They started talking online, which progressed to talking on the phone.
She was very excited to meet this person.
Jeremy Moody was a 27-year-old good old boy from Union County, South Carolina. And he was nothing like the other men Christine had dealt with in her life.
Jeremy grew up here in Union County. His father was a preacher. His mother was a homemaker. With Jeremy's father being a pastor, he was obviously heavily involved in church. He attended Bible study classes, and as he got older, he even would teach a few Bible study classes on Sunday.
The Moody family never missed the Sunday services and preached their gospel as they believed it.
Like Christine, Jeremy dreamed of one day finding his soulmate and raising a family of his own. But so far, Jeremy hadn't been lucky in love either.
Shortly after college, he met who he thought would be the love of his life. The relationship didn't work out. Jeremy decided to give online dating a try, and that's when he met Christine.
Because there was more than 2,000 miles separating them, Christine and Jeremy got to know each other through email and over the phone. Soon they were spending most of their days and nights talking to each other.
Christine and Jeremy would talk for hours. They had a really deep connection. They were able to talk for a very long time about anything that they could think of.
It seemed Christine and Jeremy were perfect together, but there was only one way to find out for sure.
Christine and Jeremy decided to meet in person.
He doesn't waste any time. He packs his bags to travel from South Carolina to see her.
The lovers were each a bit nervous to meet face to face, but when they laid eyes on each other in the flesh, they happily discovered they were even more attracted to each other. And their physical connection was even more intense than the one they shared online.
When Jeremy went to meet with Christine, their chemistry was out of control and they were obviously heavily attracted to each other.
Christine and Jeremy couldn't keep their hands off each other. For the next several days, they barely left Christine's bedroom. But their connection wasn't just sexual.
In the early parts of Jeremy and Christine's relationship, they opened up to each other and were able to share things with each other that they weren't able to do with anyone else.
He needed someone that was going to be able to show him this unconditional love. Same for her.
Christine was looking for someone she could trust. And she comes across this guy who's devoted to his family and his church.
Christine and Jeremy promised they would always be there to love and cherish one another. And just a little less than a year after they first met, the couple made their vows official.
They met in the early part of 2009, and within just months, they were married.
After the wedding, Christine and Jeremy decided to leave California and move back to Jeremy's hometown in South Carolina. It was an easy move for Christine, who only had bad memories of her home state. And in Union County, the couple could be close to Jeremy's family and his church.
Jeremy was head over heels about Christine, and his friends were really happy for him that he was so enamored with her.
The couple moved in with Jeremy's parents to save up for a place of their own and settled into the laid-back domestic life they both had dreamed of.
While Jeremy was out working, Christine fell into being a homemaker. She was very nurturing, very loving.
Jeremy and Christine were very heavily involved in their church. It was very important to both of them in their relationship.
But just months after their arrival, Jeremy and Christine's faith was tested.
Everything's going great, and then tragedy strikes.
Christine was diagnosed with breast cancer, and then it takes a turn for the worst. She has to have a double mastectomy.
Christine's bout with cancer took a toll on her body, but only strengthened the bond between the newlyweds.
Jeremy was in complete awe of her strength and her courage and saw her as a survivor.
Jeremy supported Christine and admired her, and in some ways it made Jeremy love her more.
And it was Jeremy's love, along with her faith in God, that helped Christine survive. After surgery and nearly a year of treatment, Christine's cancer went into remission. The couple were elated, and after weathering such a traumatic event, they felt nothing could stop them as long as they were together.
They both realized that they had been given a second chance, and they decided to live their life to the fullest.
But an unexpected series of twists would soon put the lovers' faith to the test and lead to a shocking discovery that would leave people wondering what dark secrets Christine and Jeremy were hiding.
This was their moment of glory.
They wanted to go down in history.
Coming up, disturbing information comes to light about the two homicide victims.
This man's past may have come back to haunt him.
And a jaw-dropping twist casts a local couple under a suspicious light.
The crime scene showed a lot of very personal hate toward these two victims.
Newlyweds Christine and Jeremy Moody were two lost souls who found each other online. And their fiery romance, combined with their faith in God, created a bond between them that seemed unbreakable.
Christine and Jeremy were completely obsessed with each other. Their love was unstoppable.
But while the newlyweds were basking in the glow of their honeymoon, investigators in nearby Union County, South Carolina, were responding to a horrific home invasion. At a rural home, an officer had discovered the aftermath of a savage attack.
As I entered the house and went into the den, I seen a male and a female, and it looked like they was deceased.
After the victims' dogs were rounded up and taken to a shelter, officers were able to approach the bodies. Police confirmed both were dead and identified them as the homeowners, 59-year-old mechanic Butch Parker and his wife, 51-year-old Gretchen.
The victims were shot at close range with a .38 caliber handgun. And then after they were shot, they were stabbed multiple times.
Gretchen Parker was slumped over the couch with her throat cut. It was disgusting.
It was clear that whoever killed the Parkers had gone to extreme measures to make sure they were dead. But why?
Their first instincts included thinking that it was just a random robbery, somebody expecting him to have a lot of cash because of his business.
Butch Parker was a mechanic who worked in his own front yard on all kinds of mechanical and small engine problems. The fact that so many people have visited the Parkers for their automotive needs opened up the pool of suspects.
However, nothing appeared to be missing from the home.
The crime scene itself was not cluttered. The house was not ransacked.
There's no forced entry into this house in this case, so it usually means that somebody knew somebody and was willing to open their door to them.
And the savage nature of the attack told investigators this hadn't been a random act of violence.
The crime scene showed a lot of very personal hate toward these two victims.
They went there for the purpose. They knew what that purpose was, and they killed them.
To find out who from the Parkers' lives might have had motive to kill them, investigators took a closer look at Butch and Gretchen's history. Investigators learned that the Parkers had moved to Union County from North Carolina a few years ago and kept mostly to themselves.
They were kind of quiet people.
When the investigators were looking at this case, they saw that the Parkers had no enemies. They were model citizens in the community. They helped people out.
But after a little more digging, police discovered that Butch and Gretchen had a very good reason for wanting to stay out of the public eye.
Butch Parker did have some problems in his background, with 2 sex offenses, one in 1991 and one in 2003.
His first offense was with a child, and the second one was with a 31-year-old handicapped woman.
He never failed to register as a sex offender each year. He was trying to get away from his checkered past, trying to turn over a new leaf and be a new person.
Butch's criminal history was not only shocking, it also provided detectives with a possible motive for the murders.
Was it one of the people he may have molested when he was younger? Was this a revenge killing?
To find out, detectives contacted authorities in North Carolina to learn more about the sexual assault cases and the victims who almost certainly still held a grudge against Butch Parker.
Butch Parker's past may have come back to haunt him.
For all they know, Butch may have gone back to his old ways and molested someone in South Carolina. Only this time, he was killed for it.
However, just as investigators had begun looking into Butch's victims for possible leads, officers at the crime scene made a startling discovery.
One of the things that we noticed that there were surveillance cameras at the scene.
If the cameras were recording on the night of the murders, investigators knew they might hold crucial evidence.
As we were in the house, I said, Captain, do you think we're really lucky enough that this video system works?
It's like a detective's dream come true. They may have actually caught these killers on tape.
But little did investigators then know that the Parker surveillance tapes had captured much more than just the killers. What was on those tapes would turn the entire case upside down and unearth a shocking menace lurking in the heart of this small town. Coming up, investigators scour the Parker surveillance footage for any trace of the killers, and in the process, uncover both a startling motive and a connection back to a local couple no one expected.
Our investigators were able to say, hey, that's Jeremy Moody, and that the girl is his wife.
By the summer of 2013, Christine and Jeremy Moody had settled into their new life together in rural South Carolina.
Jeremy and Christine were very heavily involved in their church. It was very important to both of them in their relationship.
But on the evening of July 21st, their peaceful community was rocked by the news of a gruesome double murder. 59-year-old Butch Parker and his wife Gretchen had been found brutally shot and stabbed to death inside their home, leaving Union County police scrambling for answers. Crime scene investigators discovered that the Parkers had installed security cameras, which meant they may have the killer caught on tape.
There was a sign on the property that said, "Smile, you're on camera."
When police took a closer look at surveillance footage and queued up to the time of the murders, they saw what appeared to be Butch and Gretchen Parker and 2 other people. Police suspected that the man and woman from the video might be the Parkers' killers. But the low quality of the recording made determining anything beyond the killers' genders nearly impossible.
The only problem that we had with the recording system is that the strength of lens was not that strong.
The tapes were too blurry to give detectives anything of use in the investigation. But with little else to go on, Union County investigators weren't ready to give up.
I reached out to Sheriff Chuck Wright in Spartanburg County. I called him and I told him, don't you have the capability of enhancing video? He said, yes.
Realizing it was a long shot, Union County Police turned the tapes over to specialists in Spartanburg to see what they could come up with. In the meantime, investigators turned their focus to the dark secret they had uncovered from Butch Parker's past.
He had had 2 sexual molestation charges against him.
Even though Butch's crimes were over a decade old, investigators knew that if one of Butch's victims wanted to find him, it wouldn't have been hard to do.
State law requires us to post all sex offenders on the statewide database.
So they thought, is this somebody who he had molested in the past? Did they come back to haunt him?
Investigators had requested records on Butch's former victims from authorities in North Carolina. When they received the case files, they hoped to find something that might reveal a potential suspect to the murders.
Maybe a friend or family member of one of the victims who thought Butch got off a little too easily. Maybe they're going to take justice into their own hands.
But the search ultimately turned out to be a dead end.
They were not finding that any of these leads were getting them anywhere.
Forensic specialists continued to work the crime scene. But other than the victims' bodies, the killers seemed to have left no physical evidence behind.
No murder weapon, no prints, no DNA. For a while, it's starting to look like they might not be able to figure out who did this.
With all other leads coming to dead ends, the case seemed to hinge on whether video specialists would be able to enhance the grainy video footage of the suspected killers. And on July 23rd, investigators got the break they were hoping for. Video specialists in Spartanburg had successfully enhanced the surveillance footage from the Parkers' home.
We got the video. We brought them back to our office.
The enhanced tapes gave police a much better look at the man and woman who drove up to the Parkers' house. The footage showed the couple speaking with Butch and Gretchen in their yard, and after a few minutes, all four went inside.
On the surveillance video, you see the Parkers leading them into the house.
At first glance, the couple's interaction with the Parkers seemed friendly enough, and police were beginning to fear that the man and woman captured on the tapes weren't the killers after all. That is, until one officer noticed that as the group entered the Parkers' home, the unidentified man had pulled out a gun. A few minutes later, the cameras caught the man and woman leaving the home, but Butch and Gretchen weren't with them.
They walked back out on the side porch and smoked a cigarette, and after they smoked the cigarette, they went back to the car and drove off.
Who were this man and woman? Luckily for investigators, Union County is not that big of a place.
So they show the video to all of the officers in town, hoping that they might be able to identify these images.
A number of our investigators were able to say, hey, that's Jeremy Moody. He was arrested a couple of years before. He was selling prescription medicine.
Detectives were surprised. Aside from the drug arrest in 2012, Jeremy Moody was not known for being a troublemaker.
Jeremy's dad was a preacher. Jeremy was a Sunday school teacher.
And at his indictment on his drug charges, Jeremy had explained that he was only selling the pills to help pay off medical bills that had piled up from his wife Christine's battle with cancer.
Christine and Jeremy had fallen on hard times. Christine was on disability because of her breast cancer, and Jeremy wasn't working either.
Adding to the mystery was the fact that neither Jeremy nor Christine had any apparent connection to Butch or Gretchen Parker. And with their ties to the church and Christine's medical history, the Moodys didn't seem like the kind of people to be involved in such a brutal murder.
At first glance, Christine and Jeremy don't really jump out to you as cold-blooded killers. He's just a good old boy from South Carolina, and she could be the girl next door.
But one officer thought otherwise. Jermaine Smith was a detective in the department's gang investigation unit, and he remembered that at the time of the drug arrest, he noticed Jeremy was covered in distinctive gang tattoos. Tattoos associated with the white power and neo-Nazi movements.
He had a skinhead on his neck and white power on the top of his head.
Multiple tattoos on his body. 88 on one hand, which is the symbol for Heil Hitler.
At the time, Detective Smith and local officers had been shocked. Jeremy had a positive reputation in town. how had he become associated with the white power movement? When pressed, Jeremy refused to share more with Detective Smith, so the investigator looked deeper into Jeremy's life and soon learned that Jeremy and Christine weren't the simple church-going couple they pretended to be.
Both Jeremy and Christine Moody were heavily involved in Crew 41, which is a neo-Nazi white supremacist group.
Jeremy's family and friends told police that they'd been horrified to learn he'd become involved in white supremacy. They also said it was Christine who'd introduced Jeremy to the hate group when he'd first gone to visit her in California.
Christine was heavily involved in white supremacy. She had numerous tattoos on her, and it became clear that Christine was the influence on Jeremy.
This movement, it seemed to bring them closer together.
It was a stunning revelation and led Detective Smith to suspect that Jeremy hadn't simply been selling pills to pay medical expenses, but was in fact involved in drug trafficking for Crew 41.
The investigators were watching Jeremy Moody because they thought maybe he was involved in the drug trade.
Smith had confronted Jeremy with this theory before he was arraigned on the drug charges. Jeremy admitted that Smith was right. He was trafficking drugs for Crew 41. And this time, Jeremy decided he was more than happy to talk about his involvement with the hate group and his white power beliefs.
He told me that he just didn't respect African Americans.
But Jeremy had been especially proud of Christine's role in the neo-Nazi organization.
She had several tattoos, one being OG triple OG on her hand, which means that she was more like a leader with the white supremacists. She was a shot caller.
They were the South Carolina connection. Jeremy and Christine had been recruiting online, trying to get people to join this organization.
The fact that Jeremy and Christine were heavily involved in a white supremacy group was shocking. But what did it have to do with the murder of Butch and Gretchen Parker?
They make a whole lot of sense to me, because if you're a white supremacist, why are you killing, child molesters? It just didn't go together.
Regardless of motive, the security camera footage seemed to prove Jeremy was the man in the Parker's video security footage. The police identified Christine as the woman who was with him. So in the early morning hours of July 24th, detectives placed Jeremy and Christine under arrest for suspicion of murder. But when investigators finally sat down to question the couple, they were in for another shock. Coming up, detectives finally learn the motive behind the Parkers' killings.
He says, "I'm not here for your money."
Only to discover the two brutal murders might just be the beginning.
He wanted to be a serial killer. He wanted to go down in history.
Christine and Jeremy Moody were newlyweds who'd overcome a frightening battle with breast cancer, thanks in part to their seemingly steadfast faith, both in the church and in each other. But in the summer of 2013, homicide detectives in South Carolina discovered that the couple's fervent passion was fueled by much darker beliefs than scripture.
Both Jeremy and Christine shared a dark side. They were both very heavily involved in the neo-Nazi community.
Even more disturbing was the fact that the couple had just been arrested for committing a horrific double homicide, after security cameras had caught them outside the home where local mechanic Butch Parker and his wife Gretchen had been found brutally shot and stabbed to death.
They went into the house that afternoon with the Parkers. We knew at that time that both of them were involved.
But investigators were left wondering, why would a self-proclaimed white supremacist kill a white couple? When police posed the question to Jeremy, he told them he was willing to reveal the couple's motive for the murders, but he was only willing to talk to one person.
Jeremy refused to talk to anybody but Officer Jermaine Smith.
Detective Jermaine Smith was the gang investigator who had previously interviewed Jeremy about his involvement with the neo-Nazi group Crew 41. But why would a white supremacist demand to speak exclusively with a black police officer?
The one person that he trusted in law enforcement was an African-American investigator, Jermaine.
Detective Smith agreed to sit down with Jeremy, who gave a surprising answer for why he requested the law enforcement officer.
He tells me, Jermaine, I'm not going to talk to anyone but you because you've never judged me. You've always been good to me.
Jeremy then proceeded to share more of his white supremacy beliefs with Detective Smith. And Jeremy made it clear that Crew 41 didn't have a problem with only African Americans.
Crew 41 truly believed that they were the master race, and they were against the Jews, the blacks, and any sexual perverts.
And for Christine and Jeremy, there was one group of people they hated more than any other: child molesters. Jeremy explained that when he and Christine first met, they'd shared everything with one another, including their darkest secrets. And Christine had admitted she hadn't just been physically abused as a child, she'd been sexually abused as well.
Christine Moody had been sexually abused since the age of 2.
Christine told Jeremy that she'd been molested by a close family friend repeatedly until she was a teenager. It was the reason she'd fled her home in the first place.
Because Christine had been abused sexually by somebody close to her, she developed post-traumatic stress disorder.
After Christine told Jeremy about her traumatic childhood, he trusted her with something he'd never been able to admit to anyone else.
Jeremy shared with Christine that he was sexually assaulted by his grandfather.
Jeremy was molested multiple times as he was growing up.
In the couple's minds, the revelation that they both shared histories of sexual abuse only made for more proof that they were soulmates.
It just made them fall more in love with each other. They were able to connect because they shared these ties together.
Those ties had also given the couple special reason to want sexual predators like Butch Parker to suffer. In fact, Jeremy revealed that just after he and Christine got married, they'd come up with a plan to exact their revenge.
And the two vowed that they would rid the world of child molesters. This became a huge obsession for Jeremy and Christine.
They were going to start by getting rid of all the sex offenders in their hometown. And at the top of the list of registered child sex offenders in Union County was the name Butch Parker.
Jeremy and Christine put their plan into motion. And after scouring the area for a list of child molesters, they pulled Butch Parker's name at random.
Mr. Parker was targeted because he was a sex offender. He had been convicted of various sexual assaults and was on the sex offender registry. That's how he came to their attention.
On the morning of July 21st, Jeremy and Christine began their day as they did every Sunday. They went to church. But once the service was over, the couple drove to Butch Parker's house, posing as customers in need of car repair.
Jeremy used the guise of pretending like he had car problems.
He walks up to the car and gets in the car and cranks the car.
Of course, nothing was actually wrong with their car. So when Butch was unable to find the source of the problem, Jeremy made another request.
He said he needed to use the phone to call somebody. And that's how he got them back in the house.
And as they go in the house, Jeremy then has a gun in his hand, with Christine having a knife behind her back.
Once they were inside, Jeremy continued to point the gun at Butch. But the mechanic didn't yet understand the danger he and his wife were in.
The Parkers are pleading with them that they have no money. But Jeremy says, "I'm not here for your money. I'm here to kill you because you're a child molester."
And then he turns around and he shoots Gretchen Parker.
At that point, both Butch and Gretchen's bodies were riddled with bullets. But both were still alive. That's when Jeremy said Christine took over with her knife.
Christine Moody goes over to Gretchen and slits her throat with a knife. She sees Parker laying there motionless, and she goes over and stabs him with a knife just for good measure.
Jeremy explained that neither he nor his wife regretted any part of what they'd done, even murdering an innocent woman.
Gretchen Parker was clearly a collateral damage. She was just Butch's wife. She was not the molester, but she was there at the time.
It was a horrifying tale of cold-blooded murder. But it wasn't over yet. According to Jeremy, this wasn't the first time he killed someone.
He told Jermaine Smith that he had killed other people.
He started to giving us names of locations where he had killed people in the past. He told us about a person that he'd killed that was fishing on a bridge and he threw in the river.
He also tried to take responsibility for a number of other deaths.
In addition to the Parkers, Jeremy tried to take credit for 4 other murders. Some he claimed were motivated by racial hatred, others by personal grudges. And while Jeremy said he committed most of these killings alone, he proudly boasted that he and Christine were planning to add more victims to his tally. In fact, the couple had already picked out the next child molester they intended to rid from Union County.
Jeremy said that if he had not been arrested that night, they were planning a murder that following Wednesday of another sex offender.
Investigators were stunned. Not only had Jeremy confessed to being a mass murderer, he showed absolutely no remorse. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the recognition of his gruesome acts of violence.
He wanted to be a serial killer. He wanted to go down in history for what he had done.
But how much of what he told them was true? How many people other than Butch and Gretchen Parker had he really killed?
There's only one person who can verify anything that Jeremy has told them, and that's his wife, Christine.
When detectives questioned Christine, she wouldn't say much, but she denied taking part in any of the murders, including the double homicide of Butch and Gretchen Parker.
When she was questioned, she said that Jeremy did it all. He had planned it, that she was just there.
Beyond her denials, Christine refused to cooperate with police. So investigators were left on their own to validate Jeremy's claims of mass murder. And a closer look at Jeremy's stories revealed nothing to back up his shocking claims.
We spent several days going to different counties that he had give us information about killing someone, but we could never come up with any victims.
We were never able to substantiate any of that information.
Jeremy might not have been the prolific serial killer he wanted police to think he was, but it was clear from the evidence that he and Christine were responsible for the very heinous and very recent murders of Butch and Gretchen Parker. And when the media caught wind of Jeremy's claim that he was trying to rid the world of child molesters, the story became an overnight sensation.
When Jeremy Moody was arrested, letters began to pour in from his supporters.
You couldn't turn the channel without hearing about it. People just couldn't get enough of it.
And all of the attention Jeremy was getting started to make Christine jealous.
When she found out that Jeremy was getting more attention from the media than she was, she called us back and gave us another statement.
Coming up, Christine Moody finally tells her side of the story. And as their sensational murder trial begins, will the jury sympathize with 2 vigilante killers of child molesters?
Child molesters do not deserve to live.
For them, they had done a good deed.
To all outward appearances, Christine and Jeremy Moody were a church-going couple in Union County, South Carolina. But the couple's dark secret had been revealed when they were arrested for the brutal double murder of 59-year-old convicted sex offender Butch Parker and his 51-year-old wife, Gretchen.
Jeremy Moody confessed to law enforcement that he had shot both Mr. and Mrs. Parker.
He said they had a plan to rid the world of child molesters. He said if they hadn't been caught, they were going to do it again.
At first, Christine denied taking part in the murders. But when she saw how much media attention her husband was getting, she called investigators back to her jail cell for another interview. Christine wanted her share of recognition for the murders and didn't seem to care about the consequences.
She was more concerned about him getting all the publicity. She made the comment that, listen, Jeremy didn't come up with this, I came up with it.
Christine actually told us that she was the mastermind.
If Christine wanted equal credit for the Parkers' murders, police and prosecutors were more than willing to give it to her. She and Jeremy were both charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. On May 6, 2014, Christine and Jeremy reunited in a Union County courthouse to enter their pleas. From the way they acted, they seemed more like long-lost lovers than cold-blooded killers.
That was the first time they'd seen each other since their arrest. They sort of fawned over each other and grabbed each other, gave each other a hug, and, were obviously smitten.
Christine and Jeremy both pled guilty to the murders of Butch and Gretchen Parker. But the unrepentant killers surprised everyone by throwing themselves on the mercy of the court.
And I know that what I've done is a sin.
I truly believe God has forgiven Jeremy and I. I hope you will too.
Attorneys for the defense asked for a reduced sentence, arguing that the couple both suffered from psychological damage as the result of childhood sexual abuse.
Christine developed post-traumatic stress disorder from the side effects of that abuse. Jeremy suffered from both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia.
However, the judge was not swayed.
The judge sentenced them to life in prison.
And after their sentencing, Christine and Jeremy made it clear they didn't regret anything they'd done.
Child molesters do not deserve to live. They got exactly what they deserve. Had to do it over again, I'd kill more.
What about what you said in court about repenting? Is that not true then?
No, it's not true. My lawyer made me say it.
Do you have anything to say to the victim's family?
May they die also.
Although the world viewed the couple as vicious murderers, it was clear they saw themselves in a very different light.
In their minds, their mission was a success. They were ridding the world of child molesters.
I don't think they understood how horrible the crime was that they committed. For them, they had done a good deed.
This was their moment of glory.
And even though the couple would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, it seemed their love would never die.
Jeremy truly believed that the love he had with his wife was unlike anything anybody had ever experienced, and it completely transcended anything that was happening to them.
On the evening of April 10th, 1994, nothing about a modest apartment on Via Domenico Oliva in Rome's Toleni district appeared destined to become part of Italian criminal history. It was an ordinary residential neighborhood where daily routines unfolded with little fanfare, and neighbors rarely imagined that one apartment could conceal a mystery that would outlive decades of police work, courtroom proceedings, and advances in forensic science. Yet behind one of those apartment doors, a crime was unfolding whose unanswered questions would continue to haunt investigators for more than 30 years. The woman who lived there was 47-year-old Antonella Di Verli, a labor consultant known for her orderly habits and private nature. She lived alone, maintained a structured life, and rarely drew attention to herself. Nothing in the publicly known facts suggests that the evening would become extraordinary. There was no report of a disturbance echoing through the building, no witness describing a violent struggle spilling into the hallway, and no obvious sign that an intruder had forced entry into her home. Instead, investigators would later reach a troubling conclusion from the absence of evidence itself. Whoever entered the apartment had most likely been admitted willingly. The following morning, April 11th, Antonella failed to arrive at work. For many people, missing a day at work might not immediately trigger alarm. Illness, traffic, unexpected obligations, countless ordinary explanations usually come before thoughts of tragedy. But as the hours passed without contact, concerns slowly replaced routine. Family members and people close to Antonella began trying to reach her. Calls went unanswered. The silence became increasingly difficult to explain. Eventually, relatives and friends decided to go to her apartment. From the outside, there was little to indicate what had happened. The building stood as it always had, The entrance showed nothing unusual. Inside the apartment, however, subtle details suggested that something was wrong. The lights were still on. The rooms appeared somewhat disordered. Yet there was no immediate sign of Antonella herself. They searched, room after room, every space that seemed obvious. But she was nowhere to be found. It was an unsettling contradiction. Her belongings remained in the apartment, suggesting she had not simply left. The lights burning inside implied that whatever had interrupted her routine had happened unexpectedly. Yet despite standing inside her own home, those searching for her could not locate her. Without answers, uncertainty settled over everyone involved. By the following day, the search resumed. This second visit would change everything. One detail stood out almost immediately. Not something seen, but something smelled. There was a strong odor unlike anything expected in an ordinary apartment. It was the smell of sealing compound, the kind of material used to close gaps and create airtight seals. The odor was unusual enough to attract attention, particularly because it had not seemed significant during the earlier search. Investigators would later learn that this seemingly insignificant detail pointed directly toward one of the strangest aspects of the entire case. Antonella's body was eventually discovered inside a wardrobe. It was not merely hidden there. The wardrobe itself had been sealed with mastic or silicone, transforming an ordinary piece of furniture into a grim enclosure. The effort required to conceal the body suggested deliberate planning after the killing had already taken place. It also explained why the discovery had been delayed despite people entering the apartment shortly after Antonella disappeared. Years later, Antonella's sister would recount a detail that only deepened the mystery. During the initial search, she said she had actually opened the wardrobe but had not found her sister. It was only during the later search, after noticing the strong smell of the sealing material, that the horrifying discovery was finally made. That extraordinary circumstance became one of the defining features of the case. The murder was no longer remembered solely because a woman had been killed inside her own home. It became known as one of Italy's most unusual locked room mysteries, not because the apartment itself had been impossible to enter, but because the victim's concealment inside a sealed wardrobe created an almost incomprehensible puzzle. How could a body remain hidden in a place that had seemingly already been checked? Why had someone gone to the effort of sealing the wardrobe after the crime? What purpose did such an elaborate act of concealment serve? As investigators began reconstructing the events inside the apartment, the questions multiplied rather than diminished. Forensic examination suggested that Antonella may first have been rendered drowsy through medication. While she was on her bed, she was struck by 2 gunshots fired from a small caliber 6.35 millimeter pistol. Yet neither bullet proved fatal. Instead, according to the medical findings, the cause of death was suffocation after a plastic bag had been placed over her head. That sequence alone was deeply perplexing. Why fire 2 shots if they were not the fatal injuries? Why resort to suffocation afterward? Why conceal the body so carefully inside a wardrobe instead of attempting to remove it from the apartment altogether? The physical evidence raised still more questions. Investigators documented a pillow pierced by a bullet. Blood remained on the bed sheets. A cartridge case lay on the floor. Bloody shoe impressions were present at the scene. A plastic bag surrounded the victim's head. Among the most intriguing discoveries was a fingerprint recovered from the wardrobe, a fingerprint that did not match any of the principal suspects known to investigators at the time. The apartment itself offered another critical clue through what it lacked. There was no evidence of forced entry, no damaged lock, no broken door, no shattered window. For detectives, this absence strongly suggested that Antonella herself had opened the door to the person who entered. Whether she recognized that individual personally or simply felt no reason to fear them remains unknown, but the conclusion shaped the investigation from its earliest days, directing attention toward people already connected to her life. Over the years, the investigation would focus on former romantic partners, financial disputes, forensic testing, witness statements, unidentified fingerprints, preserved biological samples, and even a mysterious taxi call believed to have originated from Antonella's telephone on the night of the murder. Trials would take place. Acquittals would follow. Appeals would uphold those verdicts. Journalists would revisit the evidence. Family members would continue seeking answers long after public attention had faded. More than 3 decades later, modern forensic science would be given another opportunity. In 2025, prosecutors reopened the investigation, hoping that advances in DNA analysis and fingerprint comparison might succeed where earlier techniques had failed. Preserved evidence, including fingerprints, hair samples, biological traces, and ballistic material, was examined once again with technologies unavailable in 1994. For a brief moment, there was renewed hope that science might finally identify the person who had walked out of that apartment after Antonella's death. But hope alone could not overcome the limitations of the evidence. By June 2026, the renewed investigation had produced no usable DNA capable of identifying a suspect. 3 additional fingerprint fragments were documented, yet none could be linked to a known individual. Despite decades of persistence, improved forensic methods, and repeated examination of the case file, prosecutors concluded that there was still insufficient evidence to bring charges against anyone. The investigation was recommended for closure once more. The central questions remained exactly where they had begun. Who entered Antonella D. Verley's apartment on April 10, 1994? Why did she trust that person enough to open the door? Why was she shot but ultimately killed by suffocation? Who hid her body inside a wardrobe and sealed it so carefully that its discovery was delayed? And whose fingerprints were left behind? Fingerprints that, even after more than 30 years, belong to no one investigators have been able to identify? Some criminal cases are remembered because justice is eventually achieved. Others endure because every answer leads to another question. The murder of Antonella D. Verley belongs to the latter. It is not only the story of an unsolved homicide, but of a silence that has lasted for more than 3 decades, a silence preserved inside a single apartment, behind the doors of a sealed wardrobe, where one of Italy's most enduring cold cases began. Long before her name became associated with one of Italy's most enduring unsolved murders, Antonella D. Verley lived a life that, by all available accounts, was remarkably ordinary. There were no headlines surrounding her career, no public controversies, and no indication that she sought attention. If anything, the details that survive paint the portrait of someone who valued routine, discretion, and stability over excitement. It is perhaps this quiet normality that makes the events of April 1994 feel even more unsettling. The victim at the center of this case was not someone living in constant turmoil or public conflict. She was a woman whose daily life appeared structured, predictable, and largely private. Antonella was 47 years old at the time of her death. She worked as a labor consultant, a profession requiring careful attention to legal regulations, employment matters, and administrative detail. Although relatively little has been made public about her day-to-day professional responsibilities, the role itself suggests a person accustomed to precision and organization. Labor consultants are often responsible for navigating complex employment laws, advising businesses and individuals, and ensuring that procedures are followed correctly. It is work built upon reliability, careful documentation, and trust. Nothing in the available record indicates that Antonella's professional life was marked by scandal or controversy. Instead, colleagues and those who knew her described a woman whose life reflected consistency rather than unpredictability. She kept to herself, maintained an orderly existence, and avoided drawing unnecessary attention. These characteristics would later influence the direction of the investigation. Detectives would repeatedly return to the same fundamental question. If Antonella's world was as quiet as it appeared, who would have wanted to harm her? She lived alone in an apartment on Via Domenico Oliva, located in Rome's Toleni district. The neighborhood was neither isolated nor unusually dangerous. Like many residential areas of Rome, it was home to ordinary people living ordinary lives. Apartment buildings stood side by side, neighbors followed familiar routines, and daily activity blended into the rhythm of the city. Nothing about the location itself suggested that it would become the setting for a crime discussed. Decades later, living alone often means establishing routines that become second nature. While the available evidence does not provide a detailed account of Antonella's everyday schedule, her absence from work on April 11th immediately attracted attention. That fact alone suggests that failing to appear without explanation was out of character. Those around her noticed because it was unusual enough to raise concern. It was not merely that she could not be contacted. It was that her silence did not fit the pattern of the life she had built. People who knew Antonella consistently described her as reserved. She was said to live quietly and to maintain a relatively limited social circle. Privacy appears to have been an important part of her character. There is no indication that she frequently entertained large groups of visitors or led an especially public social life. Instead, she managed her personal affairs discreetly, keeping her relationships and daily routines largely within a trusted circle. These details, while seemingly ordinary, became critically important once investigators entered her apartment. The absence of forced entry immediately suggested that whoever came through the front door was someone Antonella did not perceive as an immediate threat. A cautious and private person does not typically open the door to complete strangers late in the day without reason. Although investigators could never establish exactly who entered the apartment, the circumstances strongly indicated that Antonella either recognized the visitor or believed there was no danger in allowing that person inside. The simplicity of that conclusion carried enormous consequences. Rather than beginning with the theory of a random intruder, detectives focused their attention on people already connected to Antonella's life. Her personal relationships became central to understanding the case, not because those relationships proved guilt, but because they represented the most plausible explanation for why the apartment door had been opened voluntarily. Among those relationships, one name quickly emerged. Umberto Nardinacci was both a professional colleague and a former romantic partner. These two roles naturally drew investigators' attention. Shared work often means regular communication, familiarity with routines, and knowledge of personal habits. A previous romantic relationship added another layer of interest from an investigative perspective. Furthermore, Umberto was among the first people present at the apartment after Antonella was reported missing, placing him close to the earliest stages of the investigation. However, suspicion alone is not evidence. Investigators examined his connection to Antonella carefully, considering both his professional and personal history with her. Ultimately, despite the scrutiny placed upon him, authorities found that the available evidence was insufficient to support criminal responsibility. His statements were considered consistent with his alibi, and no court ever convicted him in connection with Antonella's murder. His role in the investigation illustrates an important principle that would repeat throughout this case. Proximity to the victim created investigative interest, but interest did not necessarily become proof. Another significant figure in Antonella's life was Vittorio Buffoni. an advertising photographer with whom she had also previously shared a romantic relationship. Unlike the information available regarding Umberto, investigators identified a specific source of conflict connected to Vittorio. Antonella had reportedly loaned him approximately 42 million lire, a substantial amount of money. According to the investigative record, disputes over that financial arrangement had developed over time. The case file also referred to threatening and extortion-related telephone calls connected to that relationship. These facts naturally elevated investigators' concerns. Financial disagreements have long been recognized as potential sources of conflict in criminal investigations, and when combined with a former intimate relationship, they presented a line of inquiry that detectives believed required close examination. Yet even here, the known facts remain measured rather than conclusive. The existence of financial disputes did not automatically establish motive, nor did it prove involvement in the murder. Throughout the years that followed, the investigation would repeatedly confront the gap between suspicion and demonstrable evidence. While certain circumstances appeared compelling, the legal process required proof capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny. Antonella herself never had the opportunity to explain the nature of these relationships during their final months. As a result, investigators were left to reconstruct her life through documents, witness testimony, and physical evidence rather than through her own account. This limitation is common in homicide investigations, yet it is particularly significant in cases where the victim lived privately and left relatively few public traces of her personal world. Looking back from the perspective of more than 3 decades, it is striking how little is actually known about Antonella beyond the essential facts. She was not a celebrity whose life had been documented extensively. She did not leave behind interviews or memoirs. Public knowledge of her personality comes primarily through those who described her as organized, discreet, and reserved. In many ways, she remains known more for the mystery surrounding her death than for the life she lived before it. That imbalance is one of the quiet tragedies of many unsolved cases. As investigations stretch across years and then decades, victims are often remembered chiefly for the violence that ended their lives. Their occupations become brief descriptions in case files. Their personalities are reduced to a handful of adjectives repeated in newspaper articles and legal documents. The unanswered questions surrounding the crime gradually overshadow the ordinary existence that preceded it. Antonella's story deserves to begin elsewhere. Before she became the victim of an infamous cold case, she was simply a woman returning home to her apartment after another day in Rome. She had responsibilities connected to her profession, people who noticed when she failed to appear, family members who became worried enough to search for her, and relationships that, while later examined in detail by investigators, had once been ordinary parts of her personal life. Nothing in the available evidence suggests that she anticipated danger on the evening of April 10th, 1994. On the contrary, one of the few conclusions investigators have consistently supported is that she voluntarily opened her apartment door. That single action, mundane in itself, would become one of the most significant facts in the entire investigation. It implied trust, familiarity, or at least the absence of immediate suspicion. It transformed the entrance to her apartment from an ordinary doorway into the point wherein unsolved mystery truly began. Everything that followed, the forensic evidence, the hidden body, the unidentified fingerprints, the courtroom proceedings, the reopened investigation decades later, would stem from those first moments inside the apartment. Yet those moments remain unseen. No witness has ever described them. No recording exists. Only the silent evidence left behind would attempt to tell investigators what happened after. Antonella welcomed someone into her home. The ordinary rhythm of her carefully organized life ended behind that door. What investigators would later discover inside the apartment would challenge assumptions, raise questions that remain unanswered decades later, and transform the quiet life of Antonella Di Veroli into one of Italy's most enduring and perplexing cold cases. The events that unfolded inside Antonella Di Veroli's apartment on April 10, 1994, have never been witnessed publicly, never recorded, and never fully reconstructed. Every attempt to understand what happened that evening relies on the physical evidence documented by investigators after the crime. Unlike cases in which eyewitnesses' surveillance footage or confessions establish a clear chronology, this investigation has always depended upon forensic findings and the conclusions that could reasonably be drawn from them. As a result, the final hours of Antonella's life remain surrounded by uncertainty. Even today, more than 3 decades later, the exact sequence of events cannot be stated with complete certainty. What follows is the reconstruction supported by the available investigative evidence. By the afternoon and evening of April 10th, Antonella was believed to be inside her apartment on Via Domenico Oliva in Rome's Toleni district. Nothing publicly documented suggests that she had plans out of the ordinary that day. Her apartment, like every other evening, should have represented the safest place available to her, a private space separated from the outside world by a single front door. That door would become one of the first and most significant clues. When investigators later examined the apartment, they found no indication that anyone had forced their way inside. There was no broken lock, no damaged frame, no shattered window, and no evidence suggesting that an intruder had entered against Antonella's will. This absence of forced entry immediately narrowed the scope of the investigation. Detectives concluded that whoever entered the apartment most likely did so because Antonella herself opened the door. That conclusion did not identify the visitor. It simply established the circumstances under which the encounter probably began. Whether the visitor was someone she knew well, someone she recognized professionally, or someone she believed posed no immediate threat has never been established. The evidence cannot answer that question. What it does suggest is that the first moments inside the apartment were likely calm enough for the visitor to gain access without violence at the entrance. At some point after entering, investigators believe Antonella may have been given medication that caused her to become drowsy. This conclusion comes from the later forensic reconstruction and remains an investigative assessment, rather than an established certainty. There is no public evidence identifying precisely how such medication may have been administered or exactly when its effects began. Nevertheless, investigators considered the possibility significant enough to include it in their reconstruction of the crime. If that interpretation is correct, it would explain why the attack unfolded in a manner so different from a sudden struggle or a violent confrontation immediately upon entry, rather than signs of a prolonged fight throughout the apartment. The evidence suggested that Antonella was on her bed when the shooting occurred. The bedroom would become the central location of the crime scene. Investigators documented blood on the bed sheets. A pillow had been pierced by a bullet. A cartridge casing lay on the floor. These physical traces established that at least part of the assault occurred while Antonella was in, or near the bed. Exactly what conversations, if any, preceded those moments is unknown. The apartment itself offered no answers beyond the evidence left behind. According to the forensic findings, 2 shots were fired using a small caliber 6.35 millimeter pistol. The caliber itself became one of the defining technical details of the investigation. Although firearms are often associated with immediate fatal injuries, the medical examination concluded that neither of the 2 gunshot wounds directly caused Antonella's death. Both shots inflicted injuries, but they were not fatal. That finding transformed the understanding of the crime. If the intention had simply been to kill as quickly as possible, the result was unexpectedly incomplete. Instead, the evidence demonstrated that another method was ultimately used to end Antonella's life. After the shooting, investigators determined that a plastic bag had been placed over her head. The official cause of death was suffocation. This sequence, gunshots followed by asphyxiation, has remained one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire case. The evidence establishes the order in which fatal events occurred, yet it does not explain why. No physical trace recovered from the apartment can reveal the decision-making process of the person responsible. Investigators could identify what happened, but not the reasoning behind it. The combination of methods distinguished the murder from many other homicide investigations. Neither the firearm nor the plastic bag alone tells the complete story. Together, they form a sequence that investigators have never been able to fully explain. The assault itself appears to have ended inside the bedroom. What followed afterward was another deliberate series of actions. Rather than leaving the body where Antonella had died, the person responsible moved her into a wardrobe inside the apartment. The concealment was not improvised. According to investigators, the wardrobe was then sealed using mastic or silicone, creating an enclosed space that significantly delayed the discovery of the victim. This detail has fascinated investigators, journalists, and the public for decades because of both its unusual nature and its practical consequences. Concealing a body inside furniture is uncommon enough. Taking the additional step of sealing the wardrobe with construction material suggested a calculated effort to prevent immediate discovery. The odor produced by the sealing compound would later become one of the most memorable details in the case. Ironically, the very material intended to conceal the crime eventually contributed to revealing it. At the time, however, the concealment achieved its apparent purpose. The apartment remained standing exactly where it always had. Nothing from the outside suggested that a homicide had occurred within its walls. The following morning, April 11th, Antonella failed to appear at work. For those who knew her, this absence quickly became concerning. She had built a reputation for reliability, making unexplained silence unusual enough to prompt immediate attention. Attempts to contact her proved unsuccessful. Family members and friends eventually went to her apartment. Inside, they encountered a puzzling scene. The lights were still on. The apartment appeared somewhat untidy. Yet Antonella herself was nowhere to be found. The circumstances created immediate uncertainty. Her belongings remained inside. There was no indication that she had packed for a trip or left voluntarily. At the same time, there was no obvious explanation for her disappearance. Those searching naturally examined the apartment as thoroughly as they could, looking for any indication of where she might be. Despite their efforts, they did not discover her body. Only later, during a second search, would events take their shocking turn. Antonella's sister would later recount that during the earlier search, she had opened the wardrobe, but had not seen her sister inside. It was only when the apartment was searched again that another detail drew attention: the strong smell of sealing compound. The odor seemed out of place. Following that clue ultimately led to the horrifying discovery. Inside the wardrobe lay Antonella's body. The realization transformed what had first appeared to be a missing person situation into a homicide investigation unlike any investigators had anticipated. From that moment onward, every object inside the apartment became potential evidence. Crime scene specialists began documenting each item systematically. The pillow bearing the bullet hole, the bloodstained bed sheets, the cartridge casing recovered from the floor, the plastic bag surrounding the victim's head, shoe impressions stained with blood. Every detail was photographed, preserved, and analyzed in an effort to reconstruct the final hours of Antonella's life. Among those discoveries was another piece of evidence that would prove particularly significant. Investigators recovered a fingerprint from the wardrobe. At first glance, fingerprints often represent some of the strongest forms of physical evidence available in a criminal investigation. Unlike witness memories, they do not fade with time. Unlike testimony, they cannot intentionally change. Yet fingerprints are valuable only when they can be matched to an identifiable individual. In Antonella's case, that match never came. The fingerprint recovered from the wardrobe did not correspond to any of the principal suspects, known to investigators during the early stages of the case. Instead of solving the mystery, it complicated it. If the fingerprint belonged to the killer, investigators had not identified that person. If it belonged to someone else entirely, its presence introduced additional uncertainty into an already confusing crime scene. The apartment yielded still more physical evidence. Bloody shoe impressions suggested movement after the attack. The location of the cartridge casing contributed to reconstructing where at least one shot had been fired. The damaged pillow and blood-stained bedding supported investigators' conclusion that the shooting occurred while Antonella was on or near the bed. Each piece fit into the emerging reconstruction. Yet, even together, they could not answer the most important question. Who had been inside the apartment? The silence surrounding those final hours proved almost as significant as the evidence itself. No documented witness publicly described hearing an argument inside the apartment. No known witness reported seeing the crime occur. No public confession ever followed. Instead, investigators were left with a room filled with physical traces but empty of explanations. As the first stage of the investigation came to an end, detectives understood that they faced a case in which the crime scene itself would become the primary witness. Every object recovered from the apartment would be examined repeatedly over the coming years. Every fingerprint would be compared. Every biological sample would eventually be revisited using technologies that did not yet exist in 1994. But on those first days after the murder, one fact overshadowed every other discovery. Someone had entered Antonella D. Verley's apartment without forcing the door. That person had left behind a scene unlike almost any other. A victim who survived 2 gunshots only to die by suffocation. A body hidden inside a wardrobe sealed with mastic. And physical evidence that seemed substantial enough to promise answers. Yet, as investigators would soon discover, evidence alone does not always reveal identity. Sometimes it preserves only the outline of a crime while leaving the person responsible hidden beyond its reach. That realization marked the beginning of an investigation that would continue for decades, transforming a single apartment in Rome into the setting of one of Italy's most enduring and enigmatic cold cases. The discovery of Antonella D. Verley's body transformed an unexplained disappearance into a homicide. Investigation unlike any many detectives in Rome had encountered. The crime scene was unusual, the method of concealment was extraordinary, and the physical evidence seemed to promise that answers could eventually be found. Yet from the earliest stages of the investigation, every important clue appeared to raise as many questions as it answered. Rather than producing a straightforward path toward identifying the killer, the evidence gradually revealed a far more complicated picture, one in which certainty remained constantly out of reach. Investigators were forced to rely almost entirely on forensic evidence, documented relationships, and carefully reconstructed timelines. Every conclusion had to be supported by what could actually be observed inside the apartment. Because there were no publicly known eyewitnesses to describe the murder itself, the apartment on Via Domenico Oliva became the investigation's primary witness, and every object recovered from it demanded careful examination. Crime scene specialists began by documenting the bedroom where investigators believed the attack had occurred. A pillow had been pierced by a bullet. confirming that at least one shot had passed through bedding during the assault. Blood-stained sheets demonstrated that Antonella had been wounded while on or near the bed. A cartridge casing recovered from the floor established the use of a small-caliber firearm, consistent with the medical findings. Nearby, the plastic bag that had ultimately caused Antonella's death remained one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence collected. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators documented bloody shoe impressions, suggesting movement after the attack had already taken place. Finally, attention focused on the wardrobe where Antonella's body had been concealed. It was there that detectives recovered one of the investigation's most intriguing discoveries: a fingerprint that did not match any of the principal suspects known at the time. Each of these pieces of evidence appeared significant individually. Together, they painted the outline of a carefully executed crime. Yet none of them identified the person responsible. The absence of forced entry remained one of the strongest investigative starting points. Detectives repeatedly returned to that simple observation because it fundamentally shaped every theory that followed. If Antonella had voluntarily opened her door, then the visitor was unlikely to have been a complete stranger forcing an opportunity. Instead, investigators concentrated on people who already occupied some place within her personal or professional life. That decision was based not on assumption, but on the physical evidence. A locked apartment with no signs of forced entry naturally narrowed the list of possibilities toward individuals who could reasonably have gained Antonella's trust. Among the first people examined was Umberto Nardinacci. His connection to Antonella immediately attracted investigative attention for two reasons. First, he had worked with her professionally as a colleague. Second, he had previously shared a romantic relationship with her. Both circumstances meant he possessed familiarity with her routines and likely knew details of her everyday life. His position became even more significant because he was among the first people present when concern over Antonella's disappearance prompted visits to the apartment. From an investigative standpoint, his involvement in those early moments made close examination unavoidable. Detectives questioned him and carefully reviewed his account of events. As in any homicide inquiry, investigators sought to determine whether his timeline aligned with independently verifiable facts. They examined available evidence, compared statements, and attempted to establish whether any physical evidence linked him directly to the crime scene. Ultimately, however, the investigation reached an important conclusion. Although Umberto Nardinacci remained a person of interest during the inquiry, authorities determined that there was insufficient evidence to charge him with the murder. His explanations were considered compatible with his alibi, and investigators could not produce physical evidence establishing criminal responsibility. He was never convicted in connection with Antonella's death. This outcome illustrated a recurring challenge throughout the investigation. Detectives could identify individuals who logically warranted scrutiny, yet suspicion alone could not satisfy the evidentiary standards required for prosecution. Investigators therefore continued examining Antonella's personal relationships in search of additional explanations. Attention soon focused on another former romantic partner, advertising photographer Vittorio Buffoni. Unlike the inquiry involving Umberto, investigators identified a documented financial dispute connected to this relationship. Antonella had reportedly loaned Buffoni approximately 42 million lire, and that debt had not been repaid. Financial disagreements frequently become important considerations during homicide investigations because they may establish possible sources of conflict. In this case, detectives also learned of threatening and extortion-related telephone calls associated with that relationship. These documented circumstances increased investigative interest considerably. They did not establish guilt, but they provided investigators with concrete issues requiring examination rather than mere speculation. The combination of a previous romantic relationship, unresolved financial obligations, and threatening communications formed a line of inquiry that detectives believed deserved careful attention. As the investigation developed, Vittorio Buffoni and his wife eventually became the central focus of criminal proceedings. Prosecutors believed the available evidence justified bringing charges. Among the factors considered was a paraffin test, a forensic technique historically used to detect possible traces associated with firing a firearm. Initially, the results appeared unfavorable to Buffoni and contributed to investigative suspicion. However, as forensic understanding evolved and the reliability of paraffin testing came under increasing criticism, the evidentiary value of that result weakened substantially. The test was ultimately regarded as unreliable and incapable of supporting conviction on its own. This shift demonstrated an important reality within criminal investigations. Scientific methods themselves evolve over time. Evidence once considered persuasive may later lose credibility as advances in forensic science reveal methodological limitations. In Antonella's case, that development significantly affected the prosecution's ability to rely upon early forensic findings. At the same time, another piece of evidence increasingly complicated the prosecution's theory. The unidentified fingerprint recovered from the wardrobe remained unexplained. If prosecutors argued that a specific individual had acted alone, the presence of a fingerprint belonging to someone else naturally raised difficult questions. The fingerprint did not correspond to the principal suspects investigators had identified. Its existence therefore weakened the certainty of any theory centered exclusively upon one known individual, rather than reinforcing a straightforward narrative. The crime scene itself continued resisting simple explanations. The investigation gradually expanded beyond individual suspects and toward broader possibilities. Journalists following the case, together with members of Antonella's family, later emphasized additional aspects of the evidence that they believed deserved renewed examination. Among these were several unidentified fingerprints that had never been conclusively attributed to any known person. Preserved hair samples and other biological materials also remained available, although the technology necessary to analyze them comprehensively did not yet exist during the original investigation. These unresolved forensic traces became increasingly significant as DNA science advanced during the following decades. Another development emerged through witness information collected during the investigation. According to later reporting, one witness stated that an unidentified man had been seen waiting outside Antonella's building before the murder. Investigators could not establish who this individual was or whether he had any connection to the crime. Nevertheless, the reported sighting contributed to what eventually became known as the third-person theory. The theory did not identify a suspect. Instead, it reflected the possibility that someone outside the individuals already investigated might have entered Antonella's life during the final hours before her death. The evidence supporting this possibility remained incomplete, but neither could it be entirely dismissed. An additional point of interest involved a telephone call placed from Antonella's apartment to a taxi company on the night of the murder. Investigators and later commentators considered the possibility that this call may have been made after the crime had occurred. If so, it raised another unanswered question. Who placed the call? Was it Antonella before the attack? Or could it have been the person responsible for the murder attempting to leave the area afterward? The available evidence has never provided a definitive answer. The telephone record became another fragment of the puzzle, important enough to attract attention, but insufficient to resolve the larger mystery. As months turned into years, investigators continued reviewing every available lead. The physical evidence remained preserved. Witness statements were reconsidered. Relationships were examined repeatedly. Yet every avenue ultimately encountered the same obstacle. None produced conclusive proof capable of identifying the killer beyond reasonable doubt. The case gradually assumed the characteristics of what investigators refer to as a cold case. That designation did not mean the investigation had been abandoned. Rather, it reflected the reality that active investigative opportunities had diminished despite substantial effort. The evidence still existed, but it no longer generated clear new directions. Public attention faded, yet Antonella's family continued seeking answers. Journalists periodically revisited the crime, highlighting its extraordinary details and questioning whether technological advances might someday reveal what earlier investigators could not. The unidentified fingerprint remained unexplained. The preserved biological evidence remained untested by modern standards. The witness describing an unknown man outside the building remained impossible to verify. Conclusively, the mysterious taxi call continued, inviting speculation without providing certainty. Over time, these unresolved elements became the defining features of the investigation, rather than a single overlooked clue waiting to expose the killer. The case evolved into a collection of unanswered questions connected by physical evidence that resisted definitive interpretation. Every important discovery possessed limitations. Every promising lead ended with uncertainty. Every investigative theory encountered evidence that either remained incomplete or pointed in more than one direction. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the investigation was not the absence of evidence, but its abundance. Investigators possessed fingerprints, ballistic evidence, blood evidence, biological material, shoe impressions, documented relationships, financial disputes, witness statements, and telephone records. Yet none of these pieces fit together tightly enough to identify the person responsible with legal certainty. Instead, the evidence preserved the outline of a carefully executed homicide while concealing the identity of the individual who committed it. As the years passed, one fact remained unchanged. Somewhere within the events of April 10th, 1994, a visitor entered Antonella D. Verley's apartment without forcing the door, left behind physical traces that investigators would examine for decades, concealed her body inside a sealed wardrobe, and disappeared without ever being conclusively identified. The investigation had revealed how extraordinary the crime was. What it still could not reveal was the name of the person who committed it. As the investigation into Antonella D. Verley's murder progressed, detectives gradually shifted their attention from reconstructing the crime scene to determining whether the available evidence could support criminal prosecution. The apartment on Via Domenico Oliva had yielded an unusual collection of forensic evidence. Investigators had documented the absence of forced entry, recovered a cartridge casing, examined the blood-stained bedroom, preserved the plastic bag that had caused Antonella's death, photographed bloody shoe impressions, and collected fingerprints, including one recovered from the wardrobe that could not be matched to any of the principal suspects. These discoveries established beyond question that Antonella had been murdered. They also demonstrated that considerable effort had been made to conceal her body. Yet proving that a homicide had occurred and proving who committed it were two entirely different challenges. As prosecutors assembled their case, they were confronted with a recurring problem that would ultimately define every stage of the judicial process. The evidence suggested possibilities, but certainty remained elusive. Among the individuals most closely examined during the investigation was advertising photographer Vittorio Bifani. His previous romantic relationship with Antonella had already drawn investigators' attention, but additional documented circumstances strengthened their interest. Antonella had reportedly loaned him approximately 42 million lire, a significant financial obligation that remained unresolved. According to the investigative record, disputes concerning money had developed between them. And authorities also examined threatening and extortion-related telephone calls connected to that relationship. Taken together, these facts created a plausible basis for further investigation. They did not establish guilt, but they provided prosecutors with a framework through which they believed the available evidence could be presented before the court. Eventually, Vittorio Buffoni and his wife were formally prosecuted in connection with Antonella's murder. The decision to bring charges reflected prosecutors' belief that the accumulated evidence justified judicial examination. Like many complex homicide cases built primarily upon circumstantial and forensic evidence, the proceedings require the court to evaluate not only individual facts, but also the way those facts interacted with one another. Every piece of evidence carried potential significance, yet each also possessed limitations. One of the most discussed forensic issues involved the paraffin test performed during the investigation. At the time, paraffin testing was used in an attempt to detect residues that might suggest a person had discharged a firearm. Initially, the result appeared unfavorable to Vittorio Buffoni and contributed to the prosecution's argument. However, as scientific understanding of paraffin testing evolved, confidence in its reliability declined substantially. The technique increasingly came to be viewed as incapable of providing dependable proof that an individual had fired a weapon. As a consequence, what had once appeared to strengthen the prosecution gradually lost much of its evidentiary value. This development illustrates an important characteristic of criminal justice. Scientific methods are not static. Techniques regarded as persuasive during one period may later be reconsidered as knowledge advances. Courts must therefore weigh evidence not only according to the standards that existed when it was collected, but also according to current understanding of its reliability. In Antonella's case, the changing perception of paraffin testing significantly affected the strength of the prosecution's forensic arguments. At the same time, another critical piece of evidence continued to challenge the theory presented against the defendants. The unidentified fingerprint recovered from the wardrobe remained unexplained. Throughout the proceedings, this fingerprint represented one of the investigation's most troubling unresolved facts. It had not been matched to the principal suspects. If the prosecution argued that responsibility rested with the individuals standing trial, the presence of physical evidence apparently belonging to someone else naturally raised reasonable questions. Courts are required to evaluate not only evidence supporting guilt, but also evidence that introduces uncertainty. In this case, the unidentified fingerprint complicated efforts to establish a complete and exclusive reconstruction of the crime. Rather than reinforcing the prosecution's position, it highlighted the possibility that investigators had not identified every individual connected to the events inside the apartment. After examining the available evidence, the court ultimately concluded that the prosecution had not met the burden required for conviction. In 1997, Vittorio Buffoni and his wife were acquitted. The verdict did not answer the questions surrounding Antonella's murder, nor did it identify another perpetrator. Instead, it reflected the legal principle that criminal responsibility must be established through sufficient and reliable evidence. Suspicion, however strong, cannot replace proof. The acquittal, therefore, left the central mystery unresolved. Antonella had unquestionably been murdered, but the identity of the person responsible remained legally unproven. The judicial process did not end there. Appeals followed, providing higher courts with the opportunity to review the proceedings and evaluate whether any legal or evidentiary errors justified overturning the verdict. Each stage reaffirmed the earlier conclusion. The acquittals remained in place, and in 2003, Italy's Court of Cassation confirmed the outcome. From a legal perspective, the proceedings against Vittorio Buffoni and his wife had reached their conclusion. Yet for Antonella's family, The case itself was far from over. The courts had determined that the available evidence was insufficient to establish criminal responsibility against those defendants. But the homicide remained unsolved. There was still no judicial determination identifying the person who had entered Antonella's apartment on April 10, 1994, attacked her, concealed her body inside the sealed wardrobe, and left behind evidence that investigators continued to examine for years afterward. As public attention gradually diminished, Antonella's family continued seeking answers. The passage of time did not diminish the unanswered questions surrounding the case. On the contrary, advances in forensic science encouraged renewed hope that evidence preserved since 1994 might eventually reveal information unavailable to the original investigators. During the decades following the murder, DNA analysis, fingerprint comparison technology, and other forensic disciplines improved dramatically. Cases once considered unsolvable had occasionally been reopened and resolved through modern scientific techniques. Those developments inspired renewed efforts to revisit Antonella's case. Members of her family, together with legal representatives, argued that preserved evidence deserved fresh examination using technologies unavailable during the original investigation. Their efforts reflected a belief shared by many families affected by unsolved crimes. Even when traditional investigative methods have reached their limits, scientific progress may create new opportunities. In 2024, the lawyer representing Antonella's sister formally petitioned for the investigation to be reopened. The request was grounded not in newly discovered eyewitnesses or confessions, but in the possibility that advances in forensic science might finally unlock answers hidden within the preserved evidence. Authorities accepted that this possibility justified renewed examination. In July 2025, prosecutors in Rome officially reopened the investigation. For the first time in many years, there was renewed optimism that modern forensic techniques might succeed where earlier investigations had failed. Specialists returned to the evidence collected more than 3 decades earlier. Every preserved item capable of yielding scientific information was carefully re-examined. DNA analysis formed a central component of the renewed effort. Biological material retained from the original investigation was subjected to modern testing methods, designed to detect genetic information with far greater sensitivity than was possible in the mid-1990s. Investigators also performed new fingerprint comparisons, hoping that advances in digital analysis might identify the previously unknown prints recovered from the apartment. Ballistic evidence, including the cartridge casing, underwent renewed examination. Preserved hair samples and additional biological traces were also analyzed using contemporary forensic procedures. The reopening represented more than a symbolic gesture. It reflected the continuing commitment of investigators to determine whether technology could compensate for the limitations that had constrained the original inquiry. Expectations were cautious but genuine. The evidence had been preserved precisely because future scientific developments might reveal information beyond the reach of earlier techniques. For Antonella's family, each new examination represented another possibility that decades of uncertainty might finally end. However, forensic science, despite its extraordinary capabilities, cannot create evidence where none exists. Its effectiveness depends entirely upon the quality and condition of the material available for analysis. As specialists completed their examinations, the results gradually became clear. By June 2026, prosecutors announced that the renewed investigation had failed to produce evidence capable of identifying the killer. No usable DNA profile suitable for identifying a suspect could be obtained from the preserved biological material. Although investigators documented 3 additional fingerprint fragments during the renewed analysis, those prints could not be matched to any known individual. the evidence remained incomplete. Instead of resolving the mystery, the modern examinations largely confirmed the difficulties that had frustrated investigators since the beginning. Important physical traces still existed, yet none established the identity of the person responsible. The scientific advances that had solved numerous other cold cases proved unable to overcome the limitations presented by this one. Faced with these findings, the Rome Public Prosecutor's Office concluded that the renewed investigation had exhausted the available opportunities. Without identifiable DNA, without fingerprint matches, and without new evidence capable of supporting criminal prosecution, authorities determined that there was insufficient legal basis to continue active proceedings. Prosecutors therefore requested that the reopened investigation once again be closed. The decision marked the end of the latest official effort to solve Antonella D. Verrilli's murder. More than 30 years after her death, the legal system had examined the case through original investigation, criminal prosecution, multiple appeals, and a comprehensive forensic reopening using modern technology. Despite those efforts, the central question remained unanswered. Antonella's family accepted the prosecutor's decision, while continuing to hope that one day the truth might still emerge. That hope reflects a reality shared by many families living with unresolved homicide cases. A legal investigation may conclude, court proceedings may end, and evidence may reach the limits of scientific analysis. Yet the search for answers rarely disappears. For Antonella D. Verrilli, the courtroom could not identify her killer. Modern forensic science could not identify the unknown fingerprints. The renewed investigation demonstrated both the remarkable progress and the unavoidable limits of criminal investigation. Justice depends not only upon determination and technology, but also upon the evidence that survives. The passage of time. In this case, that evidence preserved the story of a carefully concealed murder, but it still withheld the identity of the person who committed it. More than 3 decades after the events inside the apartment on Via Domenico Oliva, Antonella's case remained exactly what it had become in 1994, one of Italy's most enduring and deeply perplexing unsolved cold cases. When a criminal investigation ends without identifying the person responsible, there is often a temptation to measure the case solely by what remains unknown. The unanswered questions become the focus of documentaries, newspaper headlines, and public discussion. Dates, suspects, forensic reports, and legal proceedings gradually replace the memory of the individual whose life was taken. In the case of Antonella D. Verrilli, that risk has always been especially pronounced. Over the decades, her murder has become known as one of Italy's most perplexing cold cases, remembered for the extraordinary circumstances surrounding a sealed wardrobe, an unidentified fingerprint, and an investigation that stretched across more than 30 years. Yet before any of those mysteries existed, there was simply a woman living an ordinary life in Rome, a labor consultant who valued privacy, maintained an orderly routine, and expected to return safely to her own home. That ordinary life deserves to remain at the center of the story. The apartment on Via Domenico Oliva was not merely a crime scene. It was Antonella's home, the bedroom where investigators later documented bloodstained sheets and a bullet-pierced pillow had once been an ordinary room within her daily routine. The wardrobe that would become internationally associated with this investigation had once served the simple purpose found in countless homes. The transformation of those familiar spaces into symbols of an unsolved homicide reminds us that violent crime does not occur in abstract places. It interrupts ordinary lives, ordinary routines, and ordinary expectations. The events of April 10th, 1994 permanently altered not only the apartment itself, but also the lives of everyone who cared about Antonella. For her family, the passage of time could never fully replace certainty with acceptance. Every stage of the investigation offered moments of hope followed by renewed disappointment. The original inquiry promised that the physical evidence might reveal the killer. Criminal proceedings suggested that the courts might establish responsibility. Appeals created further opportunities for review. Decades later, the reopening of the case through modern forensic science encouraged renewed optimism that technological advances might finally succeed where earlier investigative methods had failed. Each development represented another chance that the unanswered questions might at last receive definitive answers. Yet every stage ultimately arrived at the same destination. Antonella's murder remained unsolved. The reopening of the investigation in 2025 demonstrated both the remarkable progress and the unavoidable limitations of forensic science. Modern laboratories examined preserved biological material, compared fingerprints using technologies unavailable in 1994, revisited ballistic evidence, and analyzed hair samples that investigators had carefully retained for decades. The decision to reopen the case reflected confidence in scientific progress. Around the world, many cold cases have indeed been solved through DNA profiling, improved fingerprint analysis, and sophisticated forensic techniques developed years after the original crimes occurred. There was every reason to believe that Antonella's case deserved the same opportunity. However, science can only analyze what survives. Evidence may deteriorate, become contaminated, or simply fail to contain enough identifiable information. In Antonella's case, investigators found no usable DNA capable of identifying a suspect. Additional fingerprint fragments were recovered, yet none could be matched to a known individual. The renewed investigation therefore revealed an important truth about criminal investigations. Technological advancement expands possibilities, but it cannot guarantee answers. Even the most sophisticated forensic methods remain dependent upon the quality and completeness of the evidence available for examination. This reality does not diminish the importance of the renewed investigation. On the contrary, reopening the case demonstrated a continuing commitment to seeking justice. Even after more than 3 decades had passed, it acknowledged that unresolved homicide cases deserve continued attention whenever legitimate opportunities arise. Although the renewed forensic examinations did not identify the killer, they ensured that every reasonable scientific avenue had been explored using contemporary methods. In doing so, investigators honored the principle that unresolved cases should not simply be forgotten because they are old. Throughout the years, Antonella's family also demonstrated extraordinary persistence. Their willingness to continue advocating for renewed examination reflected a determination shared by many families affected by unsolved crimes. They understood that every preserved fingerprint, every biological sample, and every piece of evidence represented a possibility, however small, that the truth might eventually emerge. Their efforts contributed directly to the reopening of the investigation decades after the murder, ensuring that advances in forensic science were fully applied to the available evidence. Although the results did not produce the breakthrough they had hoped for, their persistence ensured that no reasonable opportunity for further examination was overlooked. The judicial outcome also carries an important lesson. During the original proceedings, Vittorio Buffoni and his wife were prosecuted but ultimately acquitted, with those acquittals later confirmed through the appellate process and by the Court of Cassation. Their case illustrates a fundamental principle of criminal justice. Courts are not asked to determine whether suspicions exist. They are asked to determine whether guilt has been established through sufficient and reliable evidence. In Antonella's case, the available evidence did not satisfy that legal standard. The acquittals did not solve the murder, nor did they identify another perpetrator. Instead, they reflected the obligation of the justice system to distinguish between suspicion and proof. That distinction is essential in every criminal case, particularly those built largely upon circumstantial evidence. One of the enduring reasons this case continues to attract attention is the extraordinary combination of facts that remain unexplained even today. Investigators concluded that Antonella most likely opened her apartment door voluntarily because no signs of forced entry were discovered. Forensic examination suggested that she may have been rendered drowsy before the attack. She was shot twice with a small-caliber firearm, yet those wounds were not fatal. Instead, she died from suffocation after a plastic bag was placed over her head. Her body was then concealed inside a wardrobe, which was sealed with mastic or silicone in a manner that delayed its discovery. A fingerprint recovered from the wardrobe did not correspond to the principal suspects. Additional fingerprint fragments discovered during the renewed investigation likewise remained unidentified. Reports also referred to an unidentified man seen outside the building before the murder and a telephone call made from Antonella's apartment to a taxi company on the night of the crime. Individually, each of these facts appears significant. Together, they create one of the most unusual investigative puzzles in modern Italian criminal history. Yet despite the remarkable nature of these details, caution remains essential. Many unsolved cases invite speculation because unanswered questions naturally encourage people to imagine explanations. Antonella's case is no exception. Over the years, theories have emerged regarding unidentified individuals, unexplained forensic evidence, and possible sequences of events. However, the documented record supports only a limited number of conclusions. The identity of the killer has never been established. The unknown fingerprints have never been conclusively identified. The witness observation of an unidentified man outside the building has never been confirmed as directly connected to the murder. The taxi call has never been definitively explained. Respect for the victim requires acknowledging not only what investigators believe, but also what they do not know. That distinction is one reason Antonella's case continues to command attention from investigators, journalists, legal scholars, and students of forensic science. It demonstrates that criminal investigations rarely unfold as neatly as they appear in fiction. Real investigations are constrained by incomplete evidence, changing scientific standards, fading memories, and the passage of time. Even when investigators work diligently and preserve evidence carefully, certainty may remain unattainable. The murder of Antonella D. Verli, therefore, stands not only as an individual tragedy, but also as a reminder of the limits that every criminal justice system must sometimes confront. There are cases in which investigators know a crime occurred but cannot identify the offender. There are cases in which forensic evidence survives, but cannot reveal the answers everyone seeks. There are cases in which courts must acknowledge that suspicion cannot replace proof. Antonella's murder embodies all of those realities. More than 3 decades have passed since April 10, 1994. Buildings have changed, investigative technologies have evolved, and generations of detectives have revisited the evidence preserved from that apartment. Yet the central mystery remains remarkably unchanged. Someone entered Antonella D. Verli's home without forcing the door. That person left behind physical evidence, concealed her body inside a sealed wardrobe, and disappeared without ever being conclusively identified. Modern forensic science has examined the surviving evidence. Courts have reviewed the available facts. Prosecutors have reopened and later concluded the investigation. Still, the identity of the killer remains unknown. Perhaps that is why Antonella's story continues to resonate. It is not remembered because of sensational speculation or dramatic courtroom revelations. It endures because it reminds us that justice is not measured solely by convictions. Sometimes justice is also reflected in the determination to continue searching for the truth. even when success cannot be guaranteed. Every preserved fingerprint, every re-examined piece of evidence, and every renewed investigative effort represents a refusal to allow a victim's story to disappear with the passage of time. Although the official investigation has once again reached its conclusion, the questions that emerged inside that apartment on Via Domenico Oliva have never truly been answered. Who was the visitor Antonella trusted enough to let inside? Why were 2 non-fatal gunshots followed by suffocation? Why was such extraordinary effort devoted to sealing a wardrobe after the murder? And whose fingerprints remain preserved in the investigative record, belonging to someone who has never been identified? Until credible new evidence emerges, those questions remain unanswered. What is known, however, is something far more certain. On April 10th, 1994, Antonella D. Verily lost her life inside her own home. Her family spent decades seeking answers. Investigators pursued every documented lead available to them. Courts carefully weighed the evidence presented before them, and modern forensic science was ultimately given the opportunity to examine the surviving material with the most advanced techniques available. Even though those efforts have not yet revealed the identity of the person responsible, they ensure that Antonella's case remains more than an unsolved file stored in an archive. It remains a testament to the enduring search for truth, to the importance of evidence over speculation, and to the simple but profound belief that every victim deserves to be remembered not only for the mystery surrounding their death, but also for the ordinary life that was unjustly taken away. More than 3 decades have passed since Antonella D. Verily was killed inside her apartment on Via Domenico Oliva. Yet the passage of time has done remarkably little to diminish the central mystery of her death. Some criminal investigations gradually accumulate enough evidence to replace uncertainty with clarity. Others benefit from unexpected confessions, newly discovered witnesses, or advances in forensic science that transform forgotten traces into decisive proof. Antonella's case seemed, for many years, to hold that same promise. The evidence had been preserved. The investigation had never been forgotten by her family. Technology had advanced dramatically since 1994. If any unsolved case appeared capable of yielding new answers through modern science, this seemed to be one of them. And yet, despite every renewed effort, the silence surrounding the crime has endured. The reopening of the investigation in 2025 represented more than a procedural decision. It reflected an acknowledgement that unresolved homicide cases deserve continued attention when legitimate opportunities arise. Prosecutors did not reopen the file because they had identified a new suspect. They reopened it because forensic science had evolved. DNA analysis had become vastly more sophisticated than it had been in the mid-1990s. Digital fingerprint comparison had improved. Techniques for examining preserved biological material had advanced in ways that earlier investigators could scarcely have imagined. There is reason to believe that evidence collected decades earlier might finally reveal information hidden beyond the reach of previous generations of forensic experts. For Antonella's family, that possibility carried understandable hope. Every preserved fingerprint represented chance. Every biological sample represented a possibility. Every item stored for decades inside evidence archives carried with it the question that had remained unanswered since April 1994. Could today's science finally identify the person responsible? The answer ultimately was no. The renewed forensic examinations did not produce a usable DNA profile capable of identifying a suspect. Additional fingerprint fragments were documented, but none could be linked to a known individual. Ballistic evidence was revisited, preserved hair samples were analyzed, and the remaining physical evidence was subjected to the best methods available. Nevertheless, The investigation reached the same conclusion that had confronted detectives decades earlier. There was simply not enough reliable evidence to identify the killer or support a new prosecution. For many observers, that outcome was deeply disappointing. Yet it also illustrates an important reality that is often overlooked when discussing modern forensic science. Advances in technology are extraordinarily powerful, but they are not miraculous. DNA cannot identify someone if no usable genetic material survives. Fingerprint databases cannot produce a match when the relevant individual's prints have never been recorded or when the recovered impressions are incomplete. Scientific progress expands possibilities, but it cannot recover information that no longer exists. Antonella's case, therefore, stands as a reminder of both the strength and the limitations of forensic investigation. It demonstrates how carefully preserved evidence can continue to provide opportunities decades after a crime has occurred. It also demonstrates that some mysteries remain unresolved despite every reasonable effort. The legal history of the case offers another equally important lesson. During the years following the murder, investigators identified individuals whose relationships with Antonella required careful examination. Former romantic relationships, financial disputes, and documented conflicts all became part of the investigative process. Courts examined the available evidence. Prosecutors presented their arguments. Defense counsel challenged those conclusions. Judges evaluated the reliability of forensic testing, the significance of physical evidence, and the legal standards required for conviction. In the end, acquittals were entered and later confirmed through the appellate courts. Those judicial decisions did not declare that investigators had solved the crime incorrectly, nor did they identify another perpetrator. Instead, they affirmed one of the fundamental principles of criminal justice. No individual may be convicted unless guilt is established through sufficient and reliable evidence. That principle protects the integrity of the legal system even in cases where the true offender remains unknown. Antonella's murder, therefore, reminds us that the pursuit of justice requires both persistence and restraint. Investigators must continue searching for answers, but courts must also recognize when the available evidence does not meet the legal standard required for conviction. The case has also become an important example within discussions of cold case investigations in Italy. Its unusual combination of forensic findings continues to attract attention not because of sensationalism, but because each confirmed fact appears to resist a simple explanation. A victim who apparently admitted someone into her home voluntarily. 2 gunshot wounds that were not fatal. Death caused instead by suffocation with a plastic bag. A body concealed inside a wardrobe that had been sealed with mastic or silicone. Unidentified fingerprints recovered from the scene. Additional fingerprint fragments discovered decades later, but still unmatched. A reported sighting of an unidentified man outside the building before the crime. A telephone call from Antonella's phone to a taxi company on the night of the murder whose significance has never been conclusively established. Each fact is documented. Each fact is important. Yet none of them identifies the killer. That combination is precisely what has allowed the case to endure for so many years. It is not a mystery created by a complete absence of evidence. On the contrary, investigators collected a substantial amount of physical evidence. The challenge has always been that every significant clue stops just short of providing certainty. The evidence outlines the crime in remarkable detail while refusing to reveal the identity of the person who committed it. Perhaps that is why Antonella di Verli's story continues to resonate long after the official investigation has once again been closed. It reminds us that real criminal investigations are rarely as complete as those portrayed in fiction. In fictional stories, every clue eventually points toward a satisfying conclusion. Every unanswered question receives an explanation. Every mystery reaches a final chapter. Reality is often different. Evidence may deteriorate. Witnesses may never come forward. Opportunities may be missed despite investigators acting diligently within the limits of the technology available at the time. The result is not necessarily investigative failure. Sometimes it is simply the consequence of circumstances that no later effort can entirely overcome. For Antonella's family, however, the case has never been an abstract lesson in criminal investigation. It has always been personal. Every anniversary marks another year without certainty. Every renewed investigation carries hope, followed by disappointment when no answers emerge. Every public discussion of the case returns attention to a loss that has never truly ended. Their decision to support the reopening of the investigation demonstrated remarkable perseverance. Even after decades had passed, they believed that every reasonable opportunity should be explored. Although the renewed inquiry did not identify the killer, it ensured that the available evidence received the most thorough scientific examination possible under modern standards. In that sense, the search for truth was pursued as far as current technology would allow. Today, the official record remains unchanged. Antonella D. Verrilli was murdered inside her apartment on April 10, 1994. She most likely opened the door voluntarily to the person who entered. She sustained 2 non-fatal gunshot wounds from a 6.35 millimeter firearm. She died from suffocation after a plastic bag was placed over her head. Her body was concealed inside a wardrobe that had been sealed with mastic or silicone. The principal suspects investigated through the judicial process were ultimately acquitted. Modern forensic analysis conducted during the reopened investigation failed to identify the unknown fingerprints or produce usable DNA capable of identifying the killer. Beyond those established facts lies only uncertainty. Who entered that apartment? Who left the unidentified fingerprints? Who sealed the wardrobe? And why? Those questions remain unanswered until credible new evidence emerges. Antonella D. Verrilli's murder will continue to occupy a unique place among Italy's most enduring cold cases, not because investigators stopped searching, but because every documented effort, from the original investigation to the most recent forensic review, has reached the same boundary. The evidence tells us that a crime occurred. It tells us how Antonella died. It tells us that someone carefully attempted to conceal what had happened. But after more than 30 years, it still cannot tell us the one answer that matters most: the name of the person responsible. If there is one lesson that emerges from the murder of Antonella D. Verrilli, it is that the truth and the proof of the truth are not always the same thing. Investigators established beyond any reasonable doubt that Antonella was the victim of homicide. They reconstructed much of what happened inside her apartment through physical evidence, medical examination, and forensic analysis. They concluded that she had most likely allowed her killer into her home voluntarily because there was no sign of forced entry. They determined that she may have been rendered drowsy before the attack. They documented that she was struck by 2 bullets fired from a small caliber 6.35 millimeter pistol, but that those wounds were not the direct cause of death. They established that she ultimately died from suffocation after a plastic bag was placed over her head. They found that her body had been hidden inside a wardrobe whose doors had been sealed with mastic or silicone, delaying its discovery. These facts are supported by the investigation. They form the foundation of everything that is known about the case. And yet, despite all of those findings, one essential truth remains missing. No investigator, no prosecutor, no judge, and no forensic expert has been able to identify with certainty the person responsible for carrying out those actions. That distinction matters because criminal investigations are ultimately measured not only by how accurately they reconstruct events, but by whether they can establish responsibility through evidence, capable of surviving judicial scrutiny. In Antonella's case, that standard has never been reached. Throughout the investigation, authorities examined people who had known her personally. Former romantic relationships and documented financial disputes became legitimate avenues of inquiry, because the evidence suggested that the killer had probably been someone Antonella trusted enough to admit into her apartment. Investigators followed those leads carefully. Prosecutors brought charges where they believed the available evidence justified doing so, and courts evaluated every argument presented before them. But the legal system ultimately concluded that the evidence was insufficient to establish guilt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, the acquittals remained in place through every level of judicial review, including the Court of Cassation. That outcome is not a failure of justice. It is an illustration of one of justice's most important safeguards. Courts are required to distinguish between possibility and proof. They cannot replace unanswered questions with assumptions simply because a case has remained unsolved for many years. In doing so, the legal process preserves a principle that is fundamental to every criminal justice system. Certainty must be earned through evidence, not through speculation. The reopening of the investigation in 2025 offered another opportunity to bridge the gap between truth and proof. Advances in forensic science had transformed countless investigations around the world. DNA profiling had solved decades-old cold cases. Improved fingerprint analysis had identified offenders long believed beyond reach. Sophisticated laboratory techniques had recovered information from evidence once considered too degraded for meaningful examination. Antonella's preserved forensic evidence, therefore, represented an opportunity. More than 30 years had passed, but science itself had changed dramatically. Investigators revisited fingerprints, biological traces, ballistic evidence, and preserved hair samples using methods unavailable in 1994. For Antonella's family, these developments carried understandable hope. Every preserved item represented another chance that modern technology might finally reveal the identity of the unknown individual whose traces had remained inside the apartment for decades. Yet the results also revealed the limits of scientific progress. No usable DNA profile capable of identifying a suspect could be recovered. Additional fingerprint fragments were found, but none matched a known individual. The renewed investigation therefore arrived at the same conclusion that had confronted detectives years earlier. The available evidence could describe the crime in extraordinary detail, but it still could not identify the person who committed it. This outcome should not be interpreted as evidence that modern forensic science failed. Rather, it demonstrates that science is constrained by the quality and quantity of surviving evidence. Laboratories cannot create genetic material where none exists. Fingerprint analysts cannot identify an unknown individual whose prints are unavailable for comparison. Even the most advanced investigative methods remain dependent upon the physical traces left behind at the scene. Antonella's case, therefore, serves as an important reminder that technological progress, while remarkable, cannot guarantee resolution in every investigation. Another reason the case continues to resonate is the extraordinary care apparently taken to conceal the crime. Concealing Antonella's body inside a wardrobe and sealing it with mastic or silicone transformed an already tragic homicide into one of Italy's most unusual investigative puzzles. That act delayed discovery and contributed to the enduring image of the case as a locked room mystery. Yet even here, caution is essential. The evidence tells investigators what was done, but not why it was done. The decision to seal the wardrobe undoubtedly affected the course of the investigation, but the reasoning behind that decision remains unknown. Real investigations often confront this distinction. Physical evidence can reveal actions without revealing intentions. It can document movements without explaining motives. It can establish chronology while leaving purpose unresolved. Antonella's murder illustrates this reality with striking clarity. Over the years, additional unanswered questions have contributed to the mystery. The unidentified fingerprint recovered from the wardrobe has never been attributed to the principal. Suspects. Reports referred to other unidentified fingerprints, preserved biological material, and hair samples that investigators hoped modern science might eventually explain. There was also information concerning an unidentified man reportedly seen waiting outside the building before the murder, as well as a telephone call from Antonella's apartment to a taxi company on the night of the crime. Each of these elements became part of the broader investigation. Each deserved careful examination, yet none ultimately provided the decisive connection necessary to identify the killer. These unresolved details continue to attract attention precisely because they exist at the boundary between evidence and uncertainty. They are documented enough to warrant discussion, yet incomplete enough to resist definitive interpretation. For historians of criminal justice, forensic investigators, and legal scholars, Antonella Di Veroli's case has become an important example of how complex homicide investigations can remain unresolved despite substantial evidence. Contrary to popular belief, most unsolved murders are not characterized by a complete absence of clues. Many contain fingerprints, witness observations, biological material, financial disputes, documented relationships, and reconstructed timelines. The difficulty lies in determining whether those pieces fit together strongly enough to identify one individual with legal certainty. Antonella's case embodies that challenge. It contains evidence that appears substantial, yet each important clue ultimately stops short of revealing the answer investigators sought. Beyond the forensic and legal significance of the case lies its human dimension. It is easy, after decades of discussion, to remember Antonella only as the victim of an unsolved murder. Yet, doing so risks allowing the mystery to overshadow the person herself. The documented record consistently describes a woman who lived quietly, maintained an orderly life, worked as a labor consultant, and kept a relatively private existence. She was noticed immediately when she failed to appear at work because her absence was unusual. She was searched for by family and those close to her because they knew something was wrong. Her story did not begin with a crime scene. It began with an ordinary life interrupted by extraordinary violence. Remembering that fact restores an essential perspective that every true crime narrative should preserve. Cases such as Antonella's often challenge our expectations. People naturally hope that every investigation will conclude with certainty. Every victim will receive justice, and every question will eventually be answered. Reality is more complicated. Sometimes investigators preserve evidence carefully, follow every documented lead, conduct multiple forensic examinations, pursue prosecutions where appropriate, and still arrive at the limits of what the available evidence can prove. Accepting those limits does not diminish the importance of the investigation. Instead, it underscores the professionalism required to distinguish established fact from speculation. Throughout more than 3 decades, investigators, prosecutors, courts, forensic specialists, journalists, and Antonella's family each contributed to preserving the search for truth. The reopening of the investigation demonstrated that the passage of time alone should never prevent authorities from reconsidering unsolved cases when legitimate scientific opportunities arise. Although the renewed inquiry did not identify the killer, it ensured that every reasonable forensic avenue available today was explored. That effort reflects an enduring commitment to justice even when success cannot be guaranteed. As of June 2026, the official position remains unchanged. The renewed investigation has been recommended for closure because no new evidence capable of supporting prosecution has emerged. Antonella Di Veroli's murder, therefore, remains one of Italy's most enduring cold cases. The evidence establishes the crime. The courts have spoken regarding the individuals who stood trial. Modern forensic science has examined the preserved material using contemporary methods. Still, one question continues to survive every investigation, every appeal, and every forensic review. Who killed Antonella Di Veroli? Until credible new evidence provides an answer, that question will remain one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in modern Italian criminal history. Not because investigators failed to search, but because the evidence, despite revealing so much, has never revealed enough. Some cases end quietly. A file is closed, evidence is archived, and the passage of time gradually turns investigation into history. Other cases, however, remain open in a different sense, not in legal terms, but in human terms. They continue to exist in conversations, in forensic reviews, in family memories, and in the persistent question that refuses to fade. The murder of Antonella Di Veroli belongs firmly in that second category. Although the official investigation has reached procedural closure at various points over the decades, the case itself has never fully settled into the past. Instead, it continues to occupy a space between resolution and uncertainty, where facts are known, but meaning remains incomplete. The final status of the investigation as of mid-2026 reflects this tension. After the case was reopened in 2025, forensic experts once again examined every preserved element of evidence using modern scientific techniques. The intention was clear: to determine whether advances in DNA analysis, fingerprint comparison, and ballistic reconstruction could finally resolve a case that had resisted identification for more than 30 years. The results, however, reinforced the central paradox of the investigation. The evidence was real, carefully preserved, and scientifically examined, but remained insufficient to identify a perpetrator. No usable DNA profile emerged. No fingerprint could be matched to a known individual. No new forensic breakthrough provided the missing link between the crime scene and a named suspect. As a result, prosecutors concluded that there was no legal basis to continue active proceedings, and the renewed investigation moved toward closure once again. This outcome might appear, at first glance, to suggest stagnation. In reality, it reflects something more complex about the nature of long-term criminal investigations. The passage of time does not erase evidence, but it does change its interpretive power. What remains after decades is often a collection of partial traces, pieces of biological material, fragments of impressions, incomplete records of communication, and reconstructed timelines that can describe what happened, but not always who was responsible. Antonella's case is a textbook example of this phenomenon. The investigative record is extensive, yet it never converges on a single identifiable individual with the level of certainty required by law. Over the years, the case has also taken on a symbolic dimension within Italian cold case discussions. It is frequently cited not because it represents a failure of investigative effort, but because it illustrates how even thorough and sustained investigations can reach an evidentiary limit. The crime scene was preserved. Forensic methods were applied. Suspects were identified and tested against available evidence. Courts evaluated the arguments presented. Decades later, modern science revisited the same material. Yet despite this continuity of effort across generations, the fundamental question remained unchanged. The identity of the killer has never been established. One of the most striking aspects of the case is how consistently the same core facts have survived. Every phase of investigation. Antonella Di Veroli was found dead in her apartment in Rome's Toleni district. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that she allowed her visitor inside. She was attacked with a small caliber firearm, suffering 2 non-fatal gunshot wounds. Her death ultimately resulted from suffocation caused by a plastic bag placed over her head. After the attack, her body was concealed in a wardrobe that had been sealed with mastic or silicone, delaying its discovery. A fingerprint recovered from that wardrobe did not match the principal suspects. These facts have remained stable across decades of review. What has changed is not the evidence itself, but the tools used to interpret it. Yet, even as forensic science advanced, the essential limitation of the case remained unchanged. Evidence can describe events with increasing precision, but it cannot always assign identity. The unidentified fingerprints, the incomplete biological traces, and the absence of a definitive DNA profile illustrate this boundary clearly. Modern technology can amplify detail, but it cannot manufacture missing data. In Antonella's case, what is absent is just as significant as what is present. The human dimension of the case, however, extends beyond forensic limitations. For Antonella's family, the passage of time has not transformed uncertainty into closure. Each investigative phase has carried its own emotional weight. The original discovery of the body transformed a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The subsequent trial introduced the possibility of legal resolution, followed by the disappointment of acquittals. The passage of years brought hope that science might eventually succeed where earlier methods did not. The reopening of the case in 2025 revived that hope once more, only for it to be tempered again by inconclusive results. This cycle of expectation and disappointment is a defining feature of many long-term cold cases, and it underscores the emotional endurance required of families who continue to seek answers long after official processes have concluded. At the same time, the persistence of the investigation across decades demonstrates something equally important: a refusal to abandon unresolved cases simply because they are old. The decision to reopen the investigation in 2025 was not symbolic. It reflected a genuine belief that advancements in forensic science might yield new insights. Even though the outcome did not produce identification, the effort itself reaffirmed a principle central to modern criminal justice systems: that time alone should not prevent reconsideration of unsolved homicides when legitimate scientific opportunities exist. From a broader perspective, Antonella D. Verrilli's case also highlights the evolving relationship between law and science. In 1994, forensic capabilities were significantly more limited than they are today. DNA profiling was in its early stages, fingerprint databases were less comprehensive, and analytical tools lacked the sensitivity available in modern laboratories. Over time, these technologies transformed investigative possibilities worldwide. Cases once considered unsolvable have been reopened and resolved through methods unimaginable at the time of the original investigation. Yet Antonella's case demonstrates that even within this era of scientific progress, there remain limits that cannot always be overcome. The presence of preserved evidence is not always equivalent to the presence of identifiable information. There's also an important lesson in how the legal system responded to the evidence. The courts did not dismiss the seriousness of the investigation. They did not ignore the forensic findings or the circumstantial connections explored by prosecutors. Instead, they applied the standard required in criminal law. Guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. When the evidence did not meet that threshold, acquittals were issued and upheld through multiple levels of judicial review. This outcome reinforces a foundational principle of justice systems that prioritize accuracy over assumption, even in emotionally compelling cases. As of today, the official narrative of the case remains defined by what can be proven rather than what is suspected. Antonella D. Verrilli was murdered in her home. The circumstances of her death have been extensively documented. The physical evidence collected from her apartment has been analyzed repeatedly over the years. Suspects have been investigated and cleared through judicial process. Modern forensic science has revisited the case and found no new identifying information. Beyond these facts, however, lies a space that has resisted closure for more than 3 decades. That space is where the case continues to exist. Not in courtrooms, not in forensic laboratories, but in the unanswered question that has remained unchanged since April 10th, 1994. Who entered Antonella D. Verley's apartment and why? Until new evidence emerges that can be tested, verified, and confirmed, that question will remain open. The investigation, in its official capacity, may be paused or closed. But in the broader sense that defines all unresolved cases, it continues. It continues in archived evidence boxes, in forensic databases, in the memories of those who worked on the case, and in the enduring determination of a family that has never stopped asking for answers. Some mysteries fade with time. Others persist because the evidence allows them to persist. The murder of Antonella D. Verley remains one of those cases, not because it lacks investigation, but because even after extraordinary effort across decades, the evidence has never converged on a single, identifiable truth. And so the case ends, as it has so often before, not with resolution, but with the same silence that has followed it since the beginning.